In the Warhammer universe, orcs like to loot everything and turn it into vehicles, so I thought, why not take an empty paint pot and turn it into a tank? A Grot tank. First, I needed an empty paint pot. And to start this whole show, the Grot. Before any of the complicated stuff could get started, I first had to prepare this paint pot. The idea I had was by removing the top section, I'll be able to insert the Grot on the top of it, and creating the turret for my Grot tank. But unfortunately, when I actually tried inserting it, it was just a little bit too small. So I tried increasing the size, but each time it was a little bit uneven, so I tried correcting it, and I overcorrected quite a few times. With this massive mistake postponed for the future, I started by sanding the paint pot. This will give weathering to my model and also make the green stuff stick better. I remember that Grot piece came from a Dakkajet, so I took out the kit to see if there was anything left. I quite honestly absolutely forgot the sheer amount of extra parts that are in this kit, and this absolutely just blew my mind. This whole time, I thought the box was almost empty. With so many choices, I ended up picking these 3 pieces that I thought could work really well for this tank. Excited with the idea of attaching all these parts, I started on by mixing some green stuff and filling in the gaps between the panels and the actual pot. Green stuff in this project will have a double purpose. It's going to be the bond that's going to be connecting all these parts to the paint pot, and additionally, I'll be trying my best to sculpt it to create the illusion of this very crude orcish welding. I'll just be trying my absolute best, and it should come out looking pretty terrible and rough naturally. Unexpected challenge that I absolutely didn't think about is trying to align the pieces that they at least roughly look straightforward. Additionally, I didn't realize the sheer amount of gaps I was going to have to fill in due to the size of these pieces. To complicate things even further, I was running out of green stuff, but it should be just the right amount for this tank. With the 2 panels connected, it was finally starting to have that Killa Kan Grot tank aesthetic. And a generous mech boy donated these very awesome looking rocket launchers. As these Grots were mech boy's assistants, he felt pretty bad at the sheer lack of DAC on this tank. So to amuse himself, he gave him some pretty nice looking rocket launchers to ensure that this thing could do some damage. All I needed to do was simply make sure that they're attached and looking relatively straightforward. I was a bit worried that they might fall off, so I did shove in some additional green stuff in there, hopefully making sure that they stay on there pretty well, then simply just adjusting them a little bit more. And with every single addition to this Grot tank, the Gretchen inside were getting absolutely excited. But something needed to power it, so first we needed to attach this engine compartment. And with the size of this engine, this is easily 300 squig powers. With the additional turbo boosters, this thing should be easily able to do 0 to 60 in about 12 minutes. While I don't have any tank tracks, I do have these really awesome looking wheels that I got from the Kill Team Terrain box set. When attaching them, I also realized the sheer perfection of the fact that they're absolutely deflated. But as the orc saying goes, you don't need inflated tires as long as you have enough squig power. And these very big holes in the tires are just additional ventilation to make sure they don't overheat. To prevent this thing from tipping over, a Grot thought that adding a 3rd wheel would actually be a perfect solution. As an orc design philosophy is essentially brute force and improvisation, slapping on a random 3rd wheel seems like a perfect solution to this problem. And this Grot saw a war boss on a trike, so you know it's a good solution. To give this model some additional details, I slapped on some additional panels that will be essentially covering up some of the details. They also wanted to go faster, so they added some turbo pistons. Nobody told these Grots that they have to be connected to anything to increase the speed, so it should work regardless. Now, it was time to address that massive enormous hole that I created at the top of the paint pot. To solve this issue, I ended up using all of the remaining green stuff I had to create these lips around the top turret. This will hopefully be just the right amount to seal the entire hole and maybe leave a little bit extra just to sculpt around it. It's the furthest thing from a perfect solution, but it's an orc solution. As my green stuff was sitting around for quite some time, some of the blue stuff ended up curing to the yellow, so when I ended up creating this mix, there was a lot more yellow than blue. This unintentionally made this piece a lot softer and a lot more difficult to work with. To complicate the matters even further, I had to leave this stuff for at least a whole day just to ensure that it cured properly, because any amount of pressure to the top turret would begin moving the green stuff around. So with the turret attached, I decided to leave it for a day just to give it some time to cure. And while waiting for that, I did think of some alternative ideas for what this thing could be. So I messed around with slapping on a massive rocket at the top of it for some extra Dakka. Next day, with the model fully cured, I entirely forgot that I was going to add some additional panels. I got out the masking tape and began cutting out the different shapes that I thought could create some cool panels. Personally, I decided to not use any super glue as I don't think it's going to be a problem, especially once I paint them. Ideally, you should probably slap some on there. The only regret I have about these is I could not find any solution to create these very interesting rivets that you often see in orc models. However, I did order some stuff that I want to try in the future for that. With the model primed up and ready, it was time to get to the painting process. I wanted this Grot tank to be very fast, so I started by priming it in a dark red color. These Grots are absolute speed maniacs, so they want to make sure that this thing goes as fast as possible. And while dry brushing on some metallics, I forgot that in the havoc of the extremely long dry time, I forgot about an important step, which was to introduce some additional textures. For this, I'll be using this really awesome stuff called Dry Rust from Vallejo, but alternatively, it should also be called the brush killer. I don't know what's in this stuff, but whenever it gets into your brush, it absolutely clunks it up, and if you allow it to get deep enough, your brush is essentially gone. So if you ever use it, make sure you use a brush that you're willing to throw away. After applying that, I ended up painting the wheels, and I also got out the mighty sponge. I used a very large amount of weathering techniques to create the idea that this thing is an absolute rust can. And sponging is one of my favorite techniques, especially when creating a very weathered looking aesthetic. For the color, I used a very desaturated looking blue. With this, I wanted to balance out the color of the extreme red I was going to have on this model, but also additionally create the illusion that this thing has just been surviving for quite a long time. While I did try applying some metallic paints, this was just a much better solution for the look I was trying to create. And while it looks incredibly bright at the moment, I'll be solving that by later on applying a wash all over the entire thing to darken everything down. But that'll be in the future. For now, I reapplied some of the red paint as I noticed that I overdid it a little bit with the weathering. But also, given the fact that I'm creating a rust can, I needed to bring out some orange rust. This is just some scale color Mars orange, but it dries incredibly matte. I never actually use it as a paint on its own, however, it does create an incredibly realistic looking rust effect. Even though it looks incredibly bright when you first apply it, once it dries out, it mattens out quite a bit, and it also has a bit of a transparency to it. I did my best to focus on the areas where I thought rust would naturally be gathering. Then I took out some gunmetal gray from Vallejo Metal Color and applied it with a sponge. Applying it with dry brushing was simply not giving it the effect I wanted to achieve, so applying it with a sponge created a much more interesting aesthetic for it. And finally, it was time to darken the entire miniature by applying this very cold dark wash over it. It's mostly water, so once it dries out, it's actually not going to be that dark, but it'll still have the very interesting effect of creating a much more natural looking dark rust. This was also when I remembered I was making an orc miniature, and going for maximum realism is just not something that orcs are about. So to balance this out and make this as orky as possible, I took the brightest red I had in my collection and created this checkered looking pattern all over the entire miniature. For the highlight, adding in a tiny amount of white, using that mix to create a very faint olacel effect. With this, I wanted to showcase that the Wa energy is activating the red color and is actually increasing the speed of this tank. But also, it's just gonna look particularly awesome. To add some additional bright colors, I took some white paint and highlighted some of the rockets as well as the lenses, using some Imperial Fist for the rockets. I want these rockets to be particularly lucky in their aiming, so I gave them the blue targeting lenses. But we can't forget about the angry little Grot inside, so for that, I used a very bright looking green for the center lens. And for the final touch, I ended up doing a lot of additional little edge highlighting on the tires as I felt like they were an important part of this model and needed some attention. Now I know you might be thinking, I forgot about the Grot inside. Due to some idiot accidentally gluing him and not being a separate piece, it was incredibly difficult to paint him. So I had to do it off camera, but I did paint him. So underneath that turret cover, we have Drog the Grot. When I started this project, I just did not expect this thing to turn out so awesome, and all I gotta say is I'm just really looking forward to making some more of these really awesome looking things. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, consider dropping a like, and I'll see you next time.